Hey, so let's dig into Houdini a little bit, just learning a few basic nodes. We'll make some tiny planets, maybe Little Prince scale planets or a little bit bigger fantasy planets. So obviously we'd start with a sphere, and we'll dive down into that sphere, and we'll learn a very, very useful node called mountain. And mountain just distorts a geometry. Click the render tab and we see how that shape has been distorted, and we can see up here in the inspector we've got lots of controls like the height of the distortion, the element size, and time is actually going to give us different distortions. Time here really means variation. And then there's lots of different types of noise that we can experiment with. But one thing we want to do before we go too much further with this is this noise doesn't have the capability of very much detail because the mesh itself is coarse. So we're going to go back up to these rows and columns that we've seen before and crank those up. And now you can see we have a much, much greater possibility for variation in our mountain. And we can go down here and look at some of these. We're using simplex noise. This is sparse convolution noise, which is gives us an entirely different look, as opposed to flow noise, which gives us another look again. And so you can experiment with all those different types of noise. Now, what are we doing with this? Well, if we take this and mix it back together with our sphere using a merge node, and we render the merge node, we now have a planet that has landforms on it. And to see this more clearly, we can add a color. And see if I hold a node over a cable, it'll insert itself. And I'll make the color blue. So now we can see we have the blue ocean and the gray landform. By the way, to move the object like this, I'm middle clicking in the window and dragging it around. And to zoom, I'm using the scroll wheel. And then to look at it from different angles, I'm left clicking and dragging. So you can play around with this and find the land that you like. Find the type of noise that you like. There, that looks pretty much like continents. I can really exaggerate them. Change the element size. I get some really giant mountains on this tiny planet. Just make adjustments until you're happy with your planet. Now let's take a look at what's happening here. We're taking a single sphere, we're coloring it blue, and merging it with a mountainous version of itself, a distorted version of itself. It would be exactly the same. If I hold down Y, I can click and drag and cut a cable. If I made another sphere, and plugged it in to the color and added it back together with the merge, you can see now my two spheres have different numbers of rows and columns. My land sphere has high resolution. My ocean sphere has low. And of course I could change that if I wanted. And that's going to have some effect on how the land and the sea are rendered. But it's just as easy to to use a single sphere and feed both processes, and then we're mixing them back together. And I'll make a new planet here, bring my sphere in, and let's say I want to put some cities on my sphere. Well, dive into my geometry node, I'm going to turn up my dim, my rows and columns, and I'm going to scatter some points onto my sphere. I'm going to scatter 300 points onto my sphere. So what this is doing is randomly placing dots, coordinates, on the surface of the sphere. And what I can do then is I can copy to points. So I can take another shape, for instance, a box, and I can copy that box to every point. Now the box is quite big, so this is going to create something that doesn't look like much at the moment. But if I turn down the scale of these boxes, we see, I've copied a box to every point that I scattered onto my sphere. And then if we bring back our friendly merge node, now I can see the boxes on my sphere. So this is the beginning of a planet with a city on it. So what could I do here? Well, I could concentrate my buildings on one area of the globe. So to start with, I'm going to hold down Y, cut these chords here, move this aside, and I'm going to show another use of the group node. In this case, I'm going to use the group node to select part of an object so that I only scatter points onto that part of the object. So I'm going to insert my group node here between the sphere and the scatter. And right now it's selecting the whole sphere. And I'm going to say keep in bounding regions, which creates this blue box. So this becomes the selection box. Anything within this box will join group 1. So if I move the selection box up, then only the top half of the sphere is selected. I've moved the center up by ½ meter. If I move it up quite high, like to 0.9, only the very top of the sphere is selected. So I'll call this group top. So now in my scatter, I can choose to selectively scatter my points onto a specific group. I'll choose top. And now when I go to scatter, all my points are just scattered onto the area specified by group top. So now when I copy the points, all of my cubes appear at the top of the sphere. So when I put my merge node back in place, merging the sphere itself and the copied points, I have these buildings on the top of my world. Now, that's not a very interesting city because all the buildings are the same size, so we'll just look at one more thing. So once I have my points, here are my scattered points, I can add an attribute to them. And an attribute that we might want to change here is scale, because we want the boxes to be different size. So I'll say attribute create. And I'll create the attribute scale. Now, here's the thing that is a little bit challenging. Scale is a 3-dimensional attribute. It's got width, height, and depth. So it's not of type float. It's of type vector. Vector is a way of saying a series of related numbers, or a set of numbers. Okay, and then I can randomize that attribute. Randomize scale. So now, when I copy the points, all of my buildings are different sizes. And when I merge it, it's looking, well, it's not like a city, it's more like a town. But if I started my box taller, all of my buildings changed proportionally. I could start my building very tall. Now it's looking more like a city. So how can we take these buildings and spread them out over the entire planet? Well, that's actually really easy. Right now we're scattering only on the group top. But if we don't want to scatter on the group top, we just delete that group. And now we're scattering across the whole globe. And that's pretty neat. But you notice immediately the buildings are not rotating with the curvature of the sphere. Why is that? Well, that's because we're missing something called normals. Normals are the vectors that tell the computer which way light should be reflected off of the surface. And those normals are also used by the copy to points node to rotate the shapes that are being copied. So we're going to add normals using the normal node to our sphere. And importantly, we're going to make the normals on the points. And as soon as we do that, we see, aha, now the buildings are being rotated according to the curvature of the sphere. Because we're copying to points, we needed to add the normals to the points. Now, of course, these are sort of long, warehousey buildings. That's pretty interesting. But if we wanted to make them tall buildings, we can just switch the shape of our buildings. Oh, that's quite nice too. Kind of tall and wide buildings. And of course, any modification we make to this box is also going to be reflected in every copy. So for instance, we could do a Boolean operation. Take a sphere here, and I want to match it to pretty close to the uniform scale of the box, 0.03 perhaps. And I'll add a Boolean. And I'll look at the result of that. Oh, that's pretty interesting, just sort of right off the bat creates this rounded form. And if we go back and render our whole thing, we're seeing, now we have these sort of tombstone shapes. That's kind of interesting. Wow, that's really unexpected, or maybe it's almost even floral in the way that it looks. And if I go to the Boolean node, and instead of intersect, I choose subtract, now I have these sort of fragments orbiting the world. I'll render that Boolean. And you can also ghost any shape that you want by clicking on this pink tab. So there's the ghost of my rectangle and the results of my Boolean. There's the ghost of my sphere. So what else could I do with this? Well, I could move the sphere up, perhaps. Move the center up by 0.1. Now I have this scooped out shape. Let's see what that looks like in my world. Oh, that's really cool. Sort of these hook-like structures on the planet. So you can really get a tremendous amount of variation in what's happening just by varying the shape that's being copied to all the points. Go back and do a little bit more with this. What happens if I move this sphere to the side? So I've just kind of scooped out the side of my building form. And now all my buildings have this scoop on the top of them. It's really easy to get to unique results. So what if I wanted my buildings to only scatter onto my landform? Well, first I'd have to reestablish my landforms, going back to our idea from the earlier tutorial. I'd add a mountain. And already something pretty interesting happens right there, because my points are being spread out on the mountain. So you see my points are scattered, no longer on a spherical shape, and so my copy to points are spread out along this non-spherical surface. It wasn't what I was looking for, but it was what I found, and it's pretty cool. So I can manipulate this mountain so that it's giving me something more along the lines of the land mass that I want. And in order to do that, I can drop down a merge node here, merge this back with the sphere, add a color, so I can tell what's land and what's not land. And send my render flag to that merge node. So now I can really see what I'm doing. And see what I've done here is I've just set up this merge. I may or may not use it in my eventual geometry, but I can render it in order to help me. So I'll go to my mountain node and make some adjustments. Can take the height way down. Mess with this element size. Get some interesting results. Try some of these other controls here. See what they do. Alright, that's pretty nice. Got some land. So, I want to scatter points only on the land. How can I do that? Well, we can use group. I'm going to insert a group node here. And I'm going to select everything inside of a bounding sphere. So this is selecting all the not land. Right? It's selecting exactly the same area that was covered by the ocean. Why? Because my sphere is size 1 by 1 by 1, and the sphere I'm using for the ocean is also size 1 by 1 by 1. So my group 4 here, which I'll give the group name not land. My group not land is not the land. But what you can see, because of the resolution of our sphere, this is very, very coarse. These continents are very, very coarse. So we're going to want to go back up to our initial sphere and really crank up the resolution on this. Maybe 300 by 300. And now I'm getting a much finer border to my land. Let's even make it 500 by 500. If this bogs your computer down, you don't have to go up that high. Go to whatever still gives you smooth motion on your computer. So now I have this group that is all the not land, and I can delete with a delete node that whole group of not land, and it's gone, right? We see, oh, I'm still ghosting this sphere here. We see that I've got just the land form. So now when I scatter my points, I'm going to be scattering them only on the land. And so when I build my buildings using copy to points, they'll be built only on the land. They're too big right now, so I'm going to go to my attribute randomize, where we're randomizing the scale, and I can actually reduce the global scale in my attribute randomize, which will make my buildings smaller. And I'm going to take them back to being traditional buildings. I'm going to get rid of this Boolean node. And now I can put my world back together. I've got my buildings. And here in this merge, I've got my land and my water. So I will connect that and look at my final merge. And now there's my buildings on my land. There are not very many buildings. So I will find my scatter and scatter many, many more. Instead of 300, let's do 3,000. And now I have a pretty crowded urban planet. I'm going to go back to my box and make these more like tall buildings. And what's interesting is the mountain had different normals. So these buildings are sticking out at kind of odd angles, even though it looks kind of cool. It, understandably is something that you'd probably want to fix. It's relatively easy to fix. You need a new node called attribute copy. And what you're going to do is you're going to copy the normals from the original sphere to the distorted landscape. So the attribute copy goes there, copying from the sphere to the mountain. And then we choose what attribute we're going to copy. We're copying the attribute n for normals. And then all the buildings stand in the expected orientation. I think the only other thing I would want to do just aesthetically is these buildings are too evenly distributed. I'd go back to my scatter node and I would relax my iterations to cluster them up. And then I'd probably even make more. This might bog down your computer, but I'll make 5,000 buildings on my planet. Yeah, that's looking like something. I like that quite a lot. So find things that you're interested in. Find things that you like. Use these tools. These are very simple, basic tools, but you can use them in lots and lots of different combinations to get a ton of different effects. You can have multiple groups. You can have multiple copy to points. You can do a tremendous range of things just with this simple set of tools.